Hello everyone, it's another Monday and again a chance for us to sip legal juice. Thank you so much for tuning into Legal Juice, the podcast with me, Rorisang Tsalung. I'm so happy that you're with me, and I really hope you've been telling all your friends and family about this podcast. Thank you so much to our sponsors, American Corners Makers Valley, as well as to Kopana, our producer, of course. Remember, we're here every Monday at 8 p.m, so please don't miss out on our conversations. The idea is to take legal concepts and break them down so that they're easy for everyone to understand. We might not necessarily solve all your problems, but we can at least chat briefly about them. I decided to bring this episode so that we could look at why having a will is a good idea, how to go about drafting one, what to remember and avoid in that process. I think we'll do a separate episode on what happens if you die without one. But please remember, this is just a chat between friends. And even though I am your friend who happens to be a lawyer, this is not a formal legal consultation. The idea behind this podcast is to simulate that 10 or 15-minute conversation we would have over the phone if we knew each other, just so that I could give you an idea of how to start looking at a particular legal problem. But I do urge you, if you want to have a more detailed chat, please reach out to your local attorney who you trust to take you into as much detail as you need. Alright, now that all of that's out the way, let's chat. About 22 years ago, my grandfather died. He died suddenly, out of nowhere really. He died from an asthma attack. He left behind his wife, his children and grandchildren. But he also left behind a few tangible assets. Some money, a few houses, land, cattle, and even a car. But of all of the things that he had, the thing I really admired the most was the fact that he left behind a will. An actual will. Now, my grandfather worked as a police officer in the backveld of Mount Fletcher during the height of apartheid in the 1950s. He was a rural man through and through, from Hangasele Matatiele, and according to today's standards, really didn't have much of an education. But his wisdom was impeccable. His foresight was out of this world. At a time when most people in his environment just assumed that the customary law would take its course when they died, he was proactive. He took matters into his own hands and decided to draft and leave behind a whole will. He wanted to have a direct say in who should be appointed to wind up his estate and who should benefit from it. He appointed a few beneficiaries, and when he changed his mind about one, he went and updated that will, like the wise person he was. Unfortunately, when he passed away, his children broke into a huge fight over whether it was valid for him to make changes to his will, and they really never resolved that matter. This story, unfortunately, isn't unique. All too often, families fight over the deceased estate of a loved one who's passed on, mostly for two reasons. Firstly, the deceased, or the person who has passed away, which we're also going to call the testator, or testatrix if it's a female, might have left a handsome estate and simply no will. So it's not really clear who he or she would have wanted to inherit that estate. And secondly, the deceased might have left a will, but his family might argue about whether the will itself is valid or if it was actually the true will of the deceased. So the major question then is, how do we avoid all of that? How can we as a people provide for our loved ones so that when we die, there should be no reason for anyone to have a fight about what we would have wanted to happen to our estate or who we would have chosen to wind up that estate? In another episode, I'll take you through the process of winding up the estate of a loved one who has just passed away, so keep an ear out for that. But for today, I just want us to talk about why you should even have a will in the first place. So let's start at the beginning. What is a will? Well, a will is a document, and that's actually the first point. It's a written document. It can't be typewritten, typed out, or even handwritten. It specifically states who you would choose to wind up your estate when you're gone, and it also sets out exactly what should happen to your estate when you die. By the way, to wind up an estate just means to wrap it up. Pay off the debts of the deceased and then share his or her assets amongst the beneficiaries. Remember, both your assets and your liabilities, or your debt, form part of your estate. So let's say you have assets worth 500,000 Rand, for example, but your debts come up to about 100,000 Rand. This would mean that your estate is actually worth 400,000 Rand. Because if you were to die today, in the process of winding up your estate, first your creditors would have to be paid before what is left is shared amongst your nominated beneficiaries. A will may also go on to provide for your children, if you have them. So for example, you might state in your will that you'd like to appoint someone specific to become the guardian of your minor children when you're no longer around, if you're a single parent. That person might not even necessarily be the same person who lives with the children, but they would have decision-making powers in respect of official legal matters concerning your kids. Like, for instance, giving permission for them to be taken out of the country for a visit or a vacation, that sort of thing. Most importantly, a will sets out exactly how you would like your estate to be shared amongst the people or organizations you choose. Now here's a quick tip. Contrary to common practice, there's actually no law to compel you to leave your estate behind to your children or your family at all. We enjoy what's called the freedom of testation in our country, which means that you're technically free to leave your assets to whoever you choose, even charity if you like. It's totally up to you. Now, we've all seen the classic scene in many of our favorite Hollywood movies where someone makes a video of themselves sitting in a huge office chair stating how they want their assets to be shared when they die. It's charming, I know, but please don't do that. Don't do that hoping that such a video will serve as a valid will on its own. It will not. It is a legal requirement that a valid will must be a written document. If your will is not in writing, that video won't save you, and you'll then be said to have died intestate, as we call it. That's just a term meaning you died either without a will or without a valid will. A whole set of consequences will kick in if that's the case. But like I said, we'll discuss that another time. So why do you need to have a will? Well, let's suppose you have no assets at all. No house, no car, no money, no clothes, no jewelry, nothing precious. Then you probably don't need a will. But let's be honest. We all have at least one thing that means something to us. It could be something big like a house or shares in a business, or something smaller like your collection of CDs or hats, your jewelry, maybe a family heirloom like a watch that's been handed down from generation to generation. Surely you should get to decide what happens to it when you die, right? That's what having a will is all about. It gives you a voice to decide that sort of thing whilst you're alive, so that when you die, other people and the law don't make that choice for you. A will simply makes it clear what your wishes were so that you can avoid a scenario where greedy family members will rush in and try to loot your estate if that's not what you wanted. A will is also a good thing to have if you have young children, particularly minors, and are concerned with what would happen to their interests should you die. I mean, what would happen if you and the other parent, God forbid, died at the same time, say in an unfortunate car accident? Let's suppose you have money tucked away somewhere and you'd want that money to be used to provide for their needs. To pay for things like school fees, clothes, medical care, that sort of thing. Who do you trust to look after that money? Most often, family members will rush in to fill the gap of the parents here, but they may not necessarily be the best people to look after your financial affairs or the affairs that now concern your children. So in your will, you may set up a trust and nominate someone who you trust, who will then be called a trustee, to oversee the finances in your children's best interests until they reach a certain age. Okay, so let's talk about who can have a will. Anyone in the country above the age of 16 can technically have a will. What's important is that you must have the capacity to draft one. So for instance, be mentally well, not be intoxicated at the time of drafting your will, that sort of thing. Remember, this is your will, so you can actually draft it yourself once you know how to do it. But it may still be a good idea to get a legal practitioner or other professional who works with will drafting, such as an attorney, someone in that department of a bank or insurance company, to look at it for you, just to help make sure that it complies with the law and won't be considered invalid when the time comes. I know the concern that comes up for a lot of people is, how much would that cost? Well, an attorney would charge a fee for drafting and keeping your will for you, but there is good news. Once a year, we have what's called Wills Week running in the country. It usually takes place in the fourth quarter of the year, and this year it ran between the 12th and 16th of September 2022. Participating attorneys will actually draft your will for free during that week, so take advantage. Next year, do a simple internet search on Wills Week and find an attorney in your area to help you draft your will at no cost. Here's another plug. Legal Aid has actually put out a precedent which you can use to draft your will quite easily. It actually looks a little like a form that you just fill in, and it's quite clear and comprehensive. Use it, don't use it, it's entirely up to you, but it's definitely an option to keep open. I'll leave the link to it on our Twitter page and in the description below. Now, the first thing to remember is that you have to sign the will right at the end, but also on each page if it's more than 1 page long. You must also remember that you need to find 2 competent witnesses to sign the will in your presence and in each other's presence. In fact, you need to sign the will in their presence as well. Find 2 people who are at least 14 years old and who are capable of being witnesses in court. So, for example, preferably not somebody who is mentally unfit to be a witness. Keep in mind that these witnesses and their spouses cannot also be your beneficiaries. So don't pick your children or spouses, for instance, if you want them to be your beneficiaries. By the way, it is possible to get someone to sign your will for you, or even draft it if you're unable to do so. Supposing the testator is unable to read or write, or is perhaps a blind person, then they might nominate somebody to sign it on their behalf. But remember, they have to do this in the presence of either a commissioner of oaths, or a magistrate, a justice of the peace, or even a notary, who must also sign each page of the document and provide a certificate confirming that the testator in fact directed the will to be drafted as it is. That person must also sign in the presence of 2 competent witnesses. Now, what should go into a will? You should probably start by revoking all previous wills in plain language, so that it's clear that you no longer intend for them to apply. This may be especially helpful if you'd forgotten that you have some old will from before somewhere. Believe it or not, most people will draft more than 1 will in their lifetime. They may change their mind a few times, nominate new beneficiaries here and there, and that sort of thing. So what you don't want is to have a valid will from long ago compete with your most recent valid will when you're gone. I'd also suggest putting the date on your will when you draft it, so that if 2 conflicting versions are found, then the most recent one will revoke the old one. Once you've done that, nominate someone to be what we call an executor or executrix, if it's a female, of your estate. This person will be responsible for winding up the estate and making sure that your assets are shared according to your will. Now, you don't have to nominate the person who drafted your will for you to be the executor, so don't let anyone bully you there. The executor is entitled to a fee for his work though, either an agreed amount or up to 3.5% of the total value of the estate, so keep that in mind. You can also appoint more than 1 person to play this role, but it cannot be any of those witnesses we spoke about. In fact, this is a good idea, especially in case one of the executors is either unable or unwilling to do this work for you. It gives you options. They will have to provide what's called security when winding up your estate, and that means they'll have to prove to the Master of the High Court that they are financially stable in their own right before winding up your estate. But you can avoid this by exempting them from this duty in your will. I strongly encourage you to take that opportunity. Now take your time to think about your assets. Name them and state clearly what should happen to them after you die in the will. Consider this carefully and make your intentions known without any hesitation. Use clear language and avoid saying things that could be interpreted in many ways. For example, instead of saying things like, "My house will become a family house when I die," consider saying something like, "I bequeath my house to my sister Manyani when I die." Who should get those diamond earrings of yours? What about your collection of records or books or cars if you have one? Consider everything, not just the big stuff, but all the stuff that actually matters to you. Whilst you're thinking about this, remember that your nominated beneficiaries may die before you. In that case, what would you want to happen to your assets if they can't inherit from you, or if they actually reject the inheritance? It's a good idea to put down an alternative in this instance so that that particular benefit doesn't become a part of your intestate estate. Don't worry, we'll discuss that concept a little more later. There may be residue left after you've dealt with the stuff that matters the most to you. It's a good idea to nominate someone to inherit that residue. That someone is called an heir, and they would basically take everything that's left. This would include all the stuff which you might not have listed item by item. Remember, if you haven't dealt with this aspect, your intestate heirs would inherit these assets. Don't worry, as I said, we'll discuss all of that in that other episode I promised you. Let's talk about changing your mind. It happens. You may decide that the person who you wanted to leave your estate to is just not deserving anymore. In this case, it's not necessary to draft a whole new will, although you can of course do that. Just remember to revoke the previous one. Another more practical option is the option my grandfather chose. It's actually to make changes on the current will. Just remember that you need to sign near the change you've made and get 2 witnesses to witness the changes that you've made. These witnesses don't have to be the same witnesses who witnessed the signing the first time around, but they'll also need to witness the changes to the will. If the person making these changes is unable to do so himself and needs help, remember that this must be done in the presence of a commissioner of oaths or magistrate or justice of the peace, as we had discussed earlier. Basically, the requirements for a valid will are also the requirements for a valid change to the will. Here's a bonus tip. If you get a divorce and you'd nominated your spouse as a beneficiary in your will previously, during the first 3 months after the divorce, here's a bonus tip. If you get a divorce and you had nominated your spouse as a beneficiary in your will, during the first 3 months after the divorce, there is a presumption that you had intended to take them out of the will. If you died during that 3-month period, they would then not inherit from you. But if you die outside of that 3-month period and didn't take them out of the will, it will then be presumed that you intended for them to inherit, and so they will. Do with that information what you will. Now that you know what a will is and what goes into one, here are some of my personal tips on the subject. Take this as bonus advice, if you will. Firstly, make sure your will is drafted in plain language. This is really not the time to show off your extensive language skills. A will must be clear to those who are left behind when you die, so that there isn't even a need to run to the courts to argue about its validity or how to interpret what your wishes were. Can you draft it in a language other than English? Of course. This is South Africa. We have many languages to pick and choose from. Plus, I haven't come across anything in the Wills Act which says that you're confined to English when drafting your will. Do what you're comfortable with, but make sure that the will is legally valid. I'd also encourage you to keep your will in a safe place where someone who you know and trust can easily find it when you die. Don't be so secretive that nobody knows that you had a will or where to find it, lest you should not make it home one day and it needs to be accessed. Very often, banks, insurers, attorneys, and other such professionals who may help you with the drafting would also offer to keep it for you. I think this is a good idea, but I still strongly recommend that you keep another original signed copy nearby where it can be easily accessed when you're no longer around. Trust me when I say that the admin of closing the final chapter of the life of a loved one can be so overwhelming, and one thing to make things just a bit easier is not having to search far and wide for the will of a deceased person. I also know that some couples may think that getting married in community of property is a romantic thing to do. I'll leave that up to you to decide. But please remember that if you've chosen this route, it means that your estate would only be the value of your half share in the joint estate. In other words, the estate you share with your spouse. This means that you can only bequeath what you have in your own half share to the people you choose. Let's make an example. Supposing Tommy and Marriott have an estate worth 1 million rand that they share together. Tommy dies and in his will bequeaths 1 million rand to his daughter. Let's call her Malasedi. This is problematic because Tommy doesn't actually have 1 million rand to bequeath to his daughter. Since he is married in community of property, he can only bequeath 500,000 rand to her since that was his half share in the joint estate. Okay, that's enough free legal information for the week. Let's meet again next week to do some more chatting on Legal Juice, the podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in, and please remember to like and share this content and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can grow. And leave your comments down below. And please go to our Twitter page at juice_legal to leave your thoughts, stories, and experiences with drafting a will. I certainly hope that was enough to get you to start thinking about your own will. Until next time, Lerato Kileo.